They laughed at the black billionaire at a general's funeral, until the 4-star general saluted him. They started laughing the moment he stepped out of the Blacktown car. A sleek Bentley pulled up to the curb outside Arlington National Cemetery, but no one seemed to care. The man who exited wasn't dressed in a tailored suit with a visible brand name. No military medals adorned his chest. No entourage followed him. He wore a plain black suit, slim tie, and polished shoes. No flash, no fuss, just presence. The whispers began before he reached the cemetery gates. "Who's that supposed to be?" someone murmured behind dark sunglasses. "Probably some local pastor," a woman chuckled. "Wrong gate, buddy." Even the cemetery staff exchanged glances. One uniformed officer leaned over to the other and muttered, "That's not a face I've seen in the defense briefings." He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. Malcolm R. Hughes adjusted his cufflink, a small piece of titanium inscribed only with M.H. He nodded politely to the woman sneering in her pearl necklace and kept walking toward the VIP entrance, where a long row of white chairs had been arranged under a white canopy. A military brass band was tuning their instruments in the distance, and an honor guard stood ready for the casket of 4-star General Joseph Whitaker. And that's when the real trouble began. "Sir, excuse me. This entrance is reserved for close family and official guests," barked David Cross, the cemetery's assistant manager, stepping in front of Malcolm with arms outstretched like a gatekeeper to Olympus. Malcolm glanced at the man's laminated badge and simply said, "I'm here to pay my respects. I understand, but this section is not open to the public." "You can use the general viewing area." Cross pointed behind him toward the crowd already corralled behind velvet ropes. A couple nearby snickered. One man in a navy blue blazer leaned toward his friend and said, "I bet he thinks he's here to deliver something." "DoorDash?" Cross added with a plastic smile. "It's a military funeral, sir. I'm sure you understand." "I do," Malcolm said, voice calm. "Joseph Whitaker was my friend." Cross gave a quick, condescending laugh. "I'm sure he had many admirers." A few heads turned now. The conversation had caught the attention of those seated in the VIP area. Someone recognized the tone. Others just smelled drama. Malcolm remained composed. "I'll wait here." He stepped back from the entrance and stood silently, his hands folded in front of him. Inside the canopy, one of the aides in dress blues glanced at a sheet. Her eyes narrowed. She whispered something into a radio and slipped out toward the back. Cross had already turned away, ushering another guest through. He didn't see the general's daughter, Lieutenant Colonel Erin Whitaker, pause when she spotted Malcolm. Her breath caught. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You know him?" asked General DeWitt beside her. "That's Malcolm Hughes," she said. "My dad used to talk about him all the time." DeWitt blinked. "That's him?" The honor guard adjusted formation. The band began its solemn march. The flag-draped casket was slowly brought forward. All eyes turned to the center aisle. But a few stayed fixed on the tall man now standing near the tree line, separated from the crowd by nothing but pride and protocol. Malcolm watched silently. The last time he'd seen Joseph Whitaker, the man had been wounded and bleeding in a sandstorm in Basra. Now, he was being lowered into the ground with 21 guns and full honors, and the man who saved his life stood uninvited behind a rope. Back in the present, the ceremonial folding of the flag began. A pause. Then a ripple. A 4-star general, Clifton DeWitt, rose from his seat without a word, stepped out of the VIP section, and walked briskly toward Malcolm. People gasped. Some stood. Cross tried to intercept. "General, sir, this area is—" DeWitt shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "Stand down." Then, in front of every whispering mouth, every mocking eye, General DeWitt squared his shoulders and saluted Malcolm Hughes. "Mr. Hughes," he said loudly, "you have no idea what it means to have you here." Silence. Even the birds stopped chirping. Malcolm nodded quietly. "Thank you, General." Cross's face drained of color. Then someone in the crowd muttered, "Wait, Hughes? Malcolm Hughes?" A second man, clearly military, blinked. "The cybersecurity guy." "The billionaire?" Another whispered, "I thought he lived in Geneva or something." Phones began to come out. General DeWitt turned to the crowd and said, "This man saved General Whitaker's life during Operation Hammerstorm. Without him, we wouldn't even be having this funeral today. And I will personally escort him to the front row." He extended his arm. Malcolm looked around once, at all the faces that had dismissed him, mocked him, tried to reduce him to a stereotype, and then he placed his hand gently on DeWitt's forearm and stepped forward. Not a single soul dared whisper after that. They just moved aside, and Cross, he faded into the background, staring at the ground, his lips thin, his face pale. But the damage was done, because now the real story was about to begin. And Malcolm Hughes wasn't just a billionaire. He was a soldier, and he remembered everything. At precisely 7:45 a.m., Malcolm Hughes stood on the balcony of his Georgetown townhouse, overlooking the Potomac River. The city was quiet, the morning sun just starting to illuminate the marble monuments across the water. He sipped his black coffee slowly, his tailored shirt pressed to perfection, but without a single logo. His eyes, however, were distant, fixed not on the view, but on something much further away. His assistant, a young woman named Jordan, entered the room hesitantly. "Everything's ready, sir. The car will be here in 10. Malcolm didn't respond immediately. Instead, he set his cup down on the rail and let the breeze ruffle the edge of his sleeve. "Cancel the driver," he said quietly. Jordan froze. "Sir? I'll take the Bentley myself. No escort, no press. No security. Today isn't about that." "But Mr. Hughes, this is a full military state funeral." "People will be expecting—" "People can expect whatever they want," Malcolm interrupted gently. "I'm not going to honor Joe with cameras following me around like I'm trying to sell stock in the company." Jordan frowned but nodded. "Understood." Malcolm turned toward her, softening his voice. "I need to be seen as just a man today. No net worth, no boardroom. Just someone who's saying goodbye." She hesitated before stepping forward. "Are you sure they'll let you in? These things are tight." "And we both know the list matters." "They won't," Malcolm said, almost with a smirk. "And that's the point." Jordan tilted her head. "You want them to stop you?" "I want to see what kind of country I'm still living in," he said. "I want to know if a man's dignity only counts when someone else vouches for it." There was a long pause before she replied. "You could have just gone as the billionaire, you know. No one would have questioned a thing." Malcolm shook his head. "That's not who Joe respected." By 8:10, he was driving himself past the Lincoln Memorial, cutting through traffic with a quiet focus. As he stopped at a red light, a homeless veteran on the corner caught his eye. Malcolm rolled down the window and handed him a crisp $100 bill. The man blinked, stunned, and muttered, "Thank you, brother." Malcolm replied, "Thank you for serving," and drove on without waiting for acknowledgement. Inside the car, his phone buzzed. Texts, news alerts, stock updates, a Forbes notification about a possible merger deal. He shut it all off with one tap. Today wasn't about business. Today was about Joseph Whitaker. Years ago, back when Malcolm still wore the olive drab of a US Army technician, he'd been stationed with Whitaker during one of the most classified operations of the Gulf War. They had never intended to bond. Malcolm was young, brilliant, and black, a combination the army didn't always know what to do with. Whitaker, already a rising officer, was stern, by the book and white, the product of a long line of decorated soldiers. They clashed, at first, until one day in a dusty outpost just outside Basra, Malcolm's systems caught an encrypted message warning of an ambush. With no time to run it through channels, he went straight to Whitaker, who nearly dismissed him. "Sir," Malcolm had said, eyes burning with conviction, "I need you to trust me, right now." And for some reason, God, instinct or gut, Whitaker did. They rerouted the convoy. 10 minutes later, the original path exploded behind them in a plume of dust and shrapnel. From that day forward, Whitaker called Malcolm his sixth sense, but the army didn't promote him. In fact, months later, after submitting a report on internal data breaches involving his superiors, Malcolm was quietly discharged for breach of protocol. He didn't fight it. He knew better. He packed up, left the military, and disappeared. What no one expected was what he did next. Armed with nothing but a laptop and a brain built for war games and code, Malcolm founded Hughes Dynamics out of a one-bedroom apartment. Within 5 years, he was protecting top-tier national infrastructure. By the time he was 40, 3-letter agencies couldn't run a single cyber op without his input. But he never once gave an interview. No magazine cover. No Black Excellence feature. He declined every award that required public attendance. Until now, only a few powerful people knew the man behind the machine. Joseph Whitaker was one of them. And now, Whitaker was dead. Malcolm parked across the street from the cemetery, stepped out of the Bentley with slow, deliberate motion, and adjusted his tie. He didn't bring bodyguards, no photographers, no business partner trying to leverage the optics. Just him. As he crossed the street, a woman walking her dog looked at him twice. "You look familiar," she said. "Are you—" "No, Mom," he said with a smile. "Just here for a friend." By the time he approached the gates, the rest of the crowd was already arriving in waves. Senators, generals, CEOs. Malcolm blended in, unnoticed. Just another silhouette in black among marble and mourning. But what no one realized, at least not yet, was that the man they'd all laughed at just an hour ago, the one they blocked from entering the VIP section, the man they thought was a driver or a preacher or a mistake. He had built the encryption on the Pentagon's missile defense system. He had sat in a secure bunker with 2 presidents. He had warned generals of cyber attacks before they even made the news. And now, he stood at the edge of the crowd, his past buried, his future unreadable, simply waiting to honor the man who once trusted him when no one else would. The irony. Even in a cemetery full of power, Malcolm Hughes remained invisible. Exactly how he planned it. The military cemetery was wrapped in silence, broken only by the sound of dress shoes on pavement and the distant flutter of flags catching in the breeze. Rows of uniformed soldiers stood like statues, their faces expressionless, as the ceremony began. Malcolm moved through the crowd slowly, his presence barely noticed by the sea of high-ranking officers and political elites. Their conversations were hushed, thick with insider talk, military operations, intelligence budgets, private contractor deals. None of them gave him a second glance. In their minds, a lone black man in a modest suit with no entourage, no insignia, no entourage, was either a driver who wandered too far or a mistake that security would soon correct. He wasn't listed in the official program. No podium speech. No acknowledgement in the eulogy. And yet, Joseph Whitaker's casket, draped in the American flag, sat just yards away, surrounded by people who once doubted his friendship with Malcolm. As the chaplain began the prayer, Malcolm quietly took a seat on the last row. That was when it began. From 2 rows up, A tall, silver-haired man in a polished Air Force dress uniform turned around and narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me," he said with a clipped tone. "This section is for official invitees." Malcolm met his gaze without flinching. "Understood." The man didn't move. "Do you have credentials?" "No," Malcolm replied simply. "Then I'm going to have to ask you to step back." "This isn't open seating." A woman nearby leaned over, whispering something into the officer's ear. She looked at Malcolm with distaste, as though he were an intruder at a private event. "He must have wandered in from the street," she said, her voice just loud enough for several people to hear. "I'm here to pay my respects," Malcolm said quietly. "That's not how this works," the officer snapped. "This isn't a public memorial." And we're on active military ground. The murmuring around them grew louder. Someone nearby chuckled and muttered, "He probably thinks this is one of those TikTok stunts." A younger Marine captain added, "Look, sir, we can escort you back to the public viewing area. You'll still have a clear view from there." Malcolm exhaled slowly and stood. "All right," he said, his voice calm. But as he turned to leave, another voice sliced through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" It was General Philip McAllister, retired but legendary. A four-star general who had once overseen NATO cyber operations. The kind of man who didn't speak unless absolutely necessary. His deep baritone and authoritative stride immediately drew eyes from every direction. The silver-haired officer straightened. "No problem, sir. Just maintaining protocol." General McAllister's eyes fell on Malcolm, and stayed there. He studied him carefully, and a flicker of recognition passed through his weathered face. "You don't recognize him?" McAllister said, his voice low, almost amused. The officer blinked. "Sir?" General McAllister stepped forward. "This man," he said slowly, addressing the entire row now watching, "once designed a counter-cyber protocol that saved a carrier fleet in the Indian Ocean. If any of you had done your damn homework, you'd know the Pentagon ran a simulation last year, based entirely on his software." He turned to Malcolm and nodded once. "It's been a long time, Mr. Hughes." The silence was deafening. Malcolm offered a small nod in return. "General?" Then came the twist. General McAllister, standing tall in full-dress blues, lifted his hand and delivered a crisp, formal salute to Malcolm Hughes. Several jaws dropped. In military tradition, a salute from a general to a civilian was virtually unheard of. But this wasn't out of pity. This was out of respect. The silver-haired officer who had tried to remove Malcolm lowered his eyes. The woman who mocked him shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and the younger Marine who had offered to escort him away looked like he'd seen a ghost. Malcolm didn't bask in the moment. He simply nodded, turned, and quietly resumed his seat at the edge of the row. General McAllister leaned down to the silver-haired man and said coldly, "Next time you open your mouth, make sure you know who you're speaking to." Then, without another word, he took his place near the casket. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Some people turned to Google. Others asked each other in hushed tones, "Who the hell is Malcolm Hughes?" The chaplain continued the service, unaware of the quiet reckoning that had just unfolded behind him. But one thing had changed. No one asked Malcolm to move again. And as the bugle began to play taps, Malcolm felt the sting of old grief, real and raw. This wasn't about pride or proving a point. It was about saying goodbye to the one man who never saw him as less. And in that sea of uniforms and polished shoes, for the first time in decades, Malcolm Hughes didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the perfectly aligned headstones. After the funeral concluded, most attendees migrated to the reception tent nearby, where white tablecloths, chilled drinks, and high-ranking chatter floated through the air. Malcolm lingered by the casket, not close enough to draw attention again, but just near enough to whisper a final goodbye. He stood quietly, head bowed, hand in his coat pocket, fingers brushing against a small bronze token, one of the few things Joe Whitaker had left him. It wasn't much, just a coin from their first deployment together. But for Malcolm, it might as well have been the Medal of Honor. He finally turned toward the reception, where things had taken on a very different tone. People who had avoided eye contact earlier were now trying to look curious without seeming obvious. A few approached with awkward smiles. "Mr. Hughes, is it? I had no idea," one man said, nervously adjusting his tie. "Really inspiring what you did in defense tech." Malcolm gave him a neutral nod, not indulging the sudden shift in tone. Another woman, who had earlier scoffed as he took his seat, now gushed. "I read that article on Hughes Tech in Forbes. You really built something extraordinary." He smiled slightly but didn't respond. Then came the real twist. From across the tent, a heavy-set man in a deep navy suit stormed toward him. Maxwell Burke, the newly appointed Secretary of Defense Contractor Liaison, and someone who'd once rejected Malcolm's proposals without even a meeting. Burke's voice boomed before he even reached Malcolm. "There you are," he said. "I've been trying to get in touch. We need to talk about the satellite encryption you were developing before you went off-grid." Malcolm's brow lifted. "Off-grid?" Burke laughed dismissively. "Well, I mean, no public appearances. No contracts. You sort of disappeared after that last big merger. People assumed you cashed out." "I did," Malcolm said flatly. Burke lowered his voice. "Look, you and I both know the department needs fresh tech leadership. Hughes Tech is still a name with weight. And this funeral? You've got the eyes of the defense world back on you. We should talk." "Why now?" Malcolm asked, his tone quiet but firm. Burke glanced around. "Come on, Malcolm, let's not play games." "You've got leverage again." Malcolm looked him in the eye. "I never lost it. You just refused to see it." That silenced Burke for a beat. Then Malcolm leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "You're still using half-finished code we scrapped 5 years ago. I saw it in the leaked specs from your contractors. I built something better, safer, but you ignored it. Because it didn't come from one of your preferred partners." Burke's face flushed. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Malcolm said, "and you'll never get access to it." The temperature in the tent dropped a few degrees. People nearby had stopped pretending not to listen, and Malcolm didn't stop there. "I'm not interested in playing the Washington handshake game," he continued. "You want security? You need integrity first. Until then, keep buying broken systems and pretending you're surprised when they fail." With that, Malcolm walked away. But he didn't leave alone. General McAllister caught up with him a few moments later, a wry grin on his face. "Still know how to shut a room down," the general said. "I never did like receptions," Malcolm replied. They walked toward the edge of the cemetery, where Malcolm's black Lincoln waited, parked away from the chaos. "You know," McAllister said, "Joe would have loved that." Malcolm's expression softened. "I didn't come here to be recognized." "No," the general said. "You came here to be remembered." A quiet pause settled between them. Then Malcolm added, "I stayed out of the spotlight on purpose. People respect power more than principle these days. I wanted to prove that principles could still shake rooms." The general nodded slowly. "And they did." But just as Malcolm reached for the car door, another voice called out, "Sir?" He turned. A young soldier, barely 20, stood a few feet away, eyes wide with nervousness. I just wanted to say thank you," he said, "not just for what you built, but for today." I've been dealing with stuff in my unit. Race stuff. It's been hard. Malcolm looked him in the eye. It always is. But don't confuse silence with weakness. The soldier nodded, swallowing hard. As Malcolm climbed into the back seat, the weight of the day began to settle in his chest. He hadn't planned to challenge a defense official, deliver a public lesson in humility, or be saluted by one of the highest-ranking generals in the country. But maybe that's what Joe would have wanted. Not a quiet goodbye, but a reckoning. And Malcolm Hughes wasn't done yet. Malcolm leaned against the cool glass of his penthouse window overlooking the Potomac. Below, Washington buzzed in the late evening traffic, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering above them. His conversation with Burke had spread like wildfire among the defense elite. Calls flooded his assistant's inbox, media requests, military interest, and even a private dinner invite from the Vice President's Chief of Staff. But Malcolm wasn't celebrating. He stood alone, a whiskey glass in hand, untouched. Across the room, the television played on mute, a defense panel arguing about systemic gaps in military tech, referencing unnamed private innovators as the potential key. His name wasn't mentioned, but he knew. Everyone in that room knew. The Hughes name was once again a force. He turned toward his desk, where an old folder lay open, handwritten notes from Joe. Tactical briefings, ethics reminders, scribbled jokes only they would get. One page caught his eye. Joe had written it years ago after a botched mission in Libya. "We follow orders, but never forget who we serve." The page trembled slightly in Malcolm's hand. That mission had almost cost them both their lives. But more than that, it had shown Malcolm what kind of man Joe was. Loyal to people, not systems. The phone buzzed. "Caller ID, General McAllister," he answered. "Yeah? We have a situation," McAllister said immediately. "Burke's not taking yesterday lightly. He's twisting it into an attack on national security. He's implying you leaked military vulnerabilities by speaking about the software publicly." Malcolm exhaled sharply. "That bastard." "Congress is asking questions. And Malcolm, it's not just about your speech. There's chatter they're going to open an investigation into Hughes Tech's early contracts, looking for anything they can spin. They want to smear me before I step back in," Malcolm said. "They want to destroy you before you can lead," McAllister corrected. Malcolm clenched his jaw. "Let them come." But just as he hung up, another call buzzed through. This time, Chloe Marshall, a longtime Hughes Tech cybersecurity lead, and one of the few Malcolm trusted implicitly. "Chloe, what's wrong?" "You need to see this," she said, her voice low and urgent. "There's a whistleblower file spreading through private channels, signed anonymously. It links a buried Pentagon contract from 6 years ago, one tied to Joe's last deployment." Malcolm's heart dropped. "Joe's file," he said. "That was sealed. It was classified as an intel blackout." "Exactly," she replied. "Except someone reopened it last week, and the edits in the metadata, they were made on a DoD terminal linked to Burke's department." Malcolm froze. "You're saying they're using Joe's record to frame something?" he asked slowly. Chloe hesitated. "They're suggesting Joe falsified reports, that he doctored data in his final report to justify an extraction, but the timeline doesn't add up. And I pulled the logs. Joe's original files had digital signatures, but the versions they're spreading now, those are forgeries." Malcolm's voice was cold. "They're going after his name to get to me." "They're afraid of what you might expose if you come back into this world," she said. "Joe was working on something bigger, wasn't he?" "Yes," Malcolm whispered, gripping the edge of the desk. "He had proof of an internal cover-up, but he died before he could present it." "And now they're rewriting history." Silence. Then Chloe added, "You need to fight this publicly." "Not yet," Malcolm said. "Let them think I'm retreating. But when I hit back, I'm bringing everything." Later that night, Malcolm stood in front of the mirror in a crisp black suit. He hadn't worn it in years, not since Joe's wedding. The funeral had reignited something deep, not just grief, but purpose. Before stepping out, he pulled a hidden drawer from his desk and retrieved a sealed flash drive. Inside it, the original files Joe had sent him before his death, encrypted, classified, and damning. He whispered, "I told you I'd protect your legacy." Then he left for his next move. Not a boardroom, not a briefing, but a meeting with a journalist. Someone he trusted. The truth was coming. And it wouldn't just vindicate Joe. It would burn everything Burke had built. The cold wind cut through Arlington like a whisper from the past. Malcolm stood outside the Capitol building, his shoulders squared, his jaw clenched. He had just left a meeting with a Senate aide who confirmed it. An official inquiry into Hughes Tech was underway. The pretense was national security review, but everyone knew it was retaliation. As he crossed Constitution Avenue, flashes went off. A small group of reporters had been waiting. He ignored their questions until a voice pierced through the noise. "Mr. Hughes, is it true you leaked classified Pentagon intel tied to General Whitaker?" He stopped mid-step. His eyes locked on the journalist who had spoken, Stacey Monroe, a correspondent with the Ledger, and the person he had anonymously tipped days earlier. He turned slowly. "It's true I served with General Whitaker, and it's true he entrusted me with information he thought might one day protect lives. The leak? That didn't come from me. But now that it's out there, we should all be asking why the Department of Defense is trying to bury a man who spent 3 decades protecting this country." Gasps, pens scribbled, cameras zoomed in. Back at his office, Malcolm slammed the door behind him and pulled Chloe into the conference room. Agent Ramirez from the Justice Department was already waiting there. A trusted ally from Joe's past, Ramirez had served in military intelligence before moving to internal investigations. He wasn't here on record, but he knew the stakes. "I traced the forgery to a proxy node," Chloe began, tossing up a screen. "Whoever's behind this has access to Tier 3 Pentagon credentials." "That's not just Burke. It's someone above him." Ramirez nodded. "The DoD has a blackout unit designed to wipe trails and manufacture justification during covert ops. Joe flagged their activities in his final encrypted memo, which was deleted after his death," Malcolm said. "But I had a backup. Joe sent me the data 3 days before his convoy was hit." Ramirez leaned forward. "Then we have what we need. Bring this public. Force a congressional hearing." But Malcolm shook his head. "If we go public now, Burke will spin it. He'll bury it in red tape and leak something worse. We need to flip one of his insiders." Chloe raised an eyebrow. "You have someone in mind?" "Yeah," Malcolm said. "His senior policy aide, Jordan Keyes. I trained her when she interned with us before she went to the Hill. She knows how to navigate the politics and she hates corruption." The next day, under the cover of night, Malcolm met Jordan at a secluded jazz bar in Georgetown. The music softened their conversation, but the intensity of their words cut through the mellow notes. "They'll come after me," Jordan said, swirling her drink nervously. "I signed NDAs, Malcolm. You know how airtight this stuff is." "I'm not asking for the files," he said. "I'm asking for the thread that unravels them." "Point me to the weak link, and I'll do the rest." She hesitated, then reached into her purse and slid over a tiny memory card. "There's a name in there, a systems admin named Quentin Rooks. He's sloppy, likes to brag. If Burke paid someone off to falsify those logs, it was him." By the next morning, Chloe was already in touch with a contact at a private data firm in New York. Within hours, they cracked Rook's shadow accounts, Messages, payment logs, even receipts for encrypted drive swaps. It was all there. Malcolm stood with Ramirez as the evidence populated across the screen. "You ready to take this to the Hill?" Ramirez asked. "No," Malcolm replied. "I'm ready to take this to the world." They coordinated with Stacey Monroe. She agreed to hold the exclusive until Malcolm's team gave the go. But in the meantime, she dug into Burke's past, uncovering questionable no-bid contracts and offshore transfers. Then came the twist. Just as Malcolm prepared for the media storm, Burke launched a preemptive strike. CNN ran a live segment. Sources confirm Hughes Tech under criminal investigation for misuse of classified data. Burke appeared on screen, grave-faced, condemning private contractors who think patriotism is a PR strategy. Malcolm didn't flinch. Instead, he called a press conference. With reporters packed into the Hughes Tech atrium, Malcolm walked up to the podium, held up the flash drive Joe had sent him, and said, "This drive contains the final report of General Joseph Whitaker. He died believing the truth would never come to light. Today, that changes." He projected the report onto a screen behind him. Joe's voice, recorded in a secure message, played over the speakers. "If you're seeing this, it means the system failed to stop them. But maybe, just maybe, Malcolm didn't." The room froze. Reporters whispered. Cameras clicked. The world shifted. Malcolm continued. "These aren't claims, they're proof. Emails, logs, payments. Forged records. This isn't about my company. This is about a system that punishes integrity and rewards silence." He paused. "And I won't be silent." That night, the story exploded across networks. Burke's name trended, followed by Joe Whitaker and Malcolm Hughes. Inside the Pentagon, emergency meetings were called. One senator tweeted, "We need a special counsel." Outside Hughes Tech HQ, crowds gathered. Veterans, activists, everyday people? Not because of the scandal, but because one man refused to let his friend be erased, and Malcolm wasn't done yet. The storm didn't come quietly. It thundered across Washington. Within 48 hours of Malcolm's press conference, major media outlets were dissecting every line of Joe Whitaker's final report. Hashtags flooded social media. People weren't just angry, they were awakened. But behind the scenes, retaliation brewed fast. On the third morning, Malcolm's company's servers were breached. Chloe barely contained the panic in her voice as she burst into his office. "We're under attack. Someone's trying to wipe our entire internal network." I traced the IP to an encrypted cluster that's usually used for Black Ops activity. This isn't just a random hit. It's government level. Malcolm didn't blink. "Pull everything offline." "Go dark. Backups? Triple encrypted. I already initiated a remote mirror to a satellite server in Iceland." As they raced to lock things down, a knock echoed from the office door. It was Ramirez, this time not alone. Flanking him were two men in dark suits with DHS badges and an urgent tone. "They've issued a sealed indictment," Ramirez muttered. "They want to arrest you on federal charges, unauthorized possession of classified material, interference in an active investigation, and endangering national security." "Are you kidding me?" Chloe barked. "He's the one who exposed corruption." "They're not trying to convict him," Ramirez said grimly. "They're trying to shut him up." Malcolm leaned on the desk, breathing slowly. Then he straightened. "Let them come. But we make sure the story stays alive, no matter what happens to me." Within hours, Malcolm was taken into federal custody. The arrest was swift and quiet. No cameras, no fanfare, just a black SUV pulling away from the Hughes Tech campus like a shadow swallowing the light. But Chloe wasn't about to let him disappear. She called in every favor she had. Former law clerks, whistleblower advocates, even a sympathetic federal judge who once owed Joe Whitaker his life. Together, they filed a motion for a public hearing and pushed for an emergency injunction to unseal all classified files related to Project Vantage. Meanwhile, inside a sterile holding room, Malcolm faced his interrogators. One of them, a granite-faced man with a clipped tone, slid a folder across the table. "You should have stayed in your lane, Mr. Hughes." "What you did? That's espionage." Malcolm didn't flinch. "What I did was tell the truth." The man leaned forward. "You're not untouchable. We can ruin you, your company, your legacy." "Then you better start digging," Malcolm said, "because I've got more buried than you'll ever find." Outside, Chloe and Ramirez held a press briefing, and this time, the public wasn't just watching, they were marching. Protests sparked across D.C., filled with veterans holding signs with Joe's photo and 3 simple words: "Tell the truth." Then came the twist that changed everything. Jordan Keyes, the former aide who had once passed Malcolm a name, showed up on national television. "I can't stay silent anymore," she said live on MSNBC. "I was part of the inner circle. I know what Secretary Burke did. I know what they covered up. And I know Joe Whitaker was killed because he got too close to the truth." Her confession sent shockwaves. A congressional emergency session was called. Within hours, subpoenas were flying. Secretary Burke tried to issue a denial, but the evidence now included signed authorization memos, burner phone logs, and secret travel records showing he had personally met with arms contractors flagged in Joe's final report. The tide turned. Inside the detention center, Ramirez entered Malcolm's cell. "You're getting out." Charges dropped. Judge ruled the prosecution acted in bad faith. And there's more. Burke's facing indictment. Malcolm exhaled slowly, his body sagging under the weight of the news. "Did Joe's name get cleared?" Ramirez smiled. "Posthumous commendation. Full honors reinstated." By the time Malcolm stepped out of the courthouse, the crowd waiting for him filled the steps. Veterans saluted. Journalists shouted questions. Chloe stood near the front, tears in her eyes, but a grin of defiance on her face. And then, breaking through the crowd, a familiar uniform approached. 4 stars gleamed on his shoulders. General Aaron T. Langston, the only living superior officer who had served alongside Joe and Malcolm in Operation Sandbreaker, walked up to him. He extended his hand. "You honored your friend and your country," Langston said, his voice firm. "But that salute..." He stepped back and raised his hand to his brow. A crisp, silent salute from a 4-star general to a black billionaire once laughed at for simply showing up at a funeral. The crowd fell silent, then erupted. Not because Malcolm had won, but because integrity had. And the war for truth was no longer being fought in the shadows. It was out in the light. It had been 3 weeks since the storm broke. The halls of Congress buzzed with the fallout from the Whitaker scandal, and the news cycles were still saturated with words like conspiracy, hero, and cover-up. But Malcolm wasn't concerned with headlines anymore. He was on a mission Joe would have understood better than anyone. The day began with Malcolm walking into Hughes Tech's auditorium. It was packed. Reporters, activists, veterans, and curious citizens. Chloe was on stage already, setting up the stream. Behind them, a giant screen displayed 2 words in bold: Justice Forward. The event wasn't a press conference. It was a launch. Malcolm stepped to the podium, dressed simply in a navy suit, his expression calm but unyielding. "When I was 23, I sat beside Joe Whitaker in a Humvee as we crossed into the most dangerous sector of Kandahar. He looked over at me, this green kid with too much confidence, and said, Don't let people underestimate you, but don't ever forget who you are either. That stuck with me. He paused, eyes scanning the room. And yet, years later, I stood at his funeral, surrounded by suits and silence. Not one of them knew who I was. Not because I hid, but because they didn't bother to ask. Murmurs of recognition rippled across the crowd. I didn't speak that day. I just stood there while people judged me for what I looked like, not for what I had lived. That ends today. The screen behind him changed to images of Joe, smiling in uniform, training young soldiers. And the final one, the medal ceremony that had been denied but was now retroactively awarded. We created Justice Forward to make sure what happened to Joe Whitaker never happens again. Not just to veterans, not just to whistleblowers, but to every person who risks everything to do the right thing. As the room erupted in applause, Ramirez leaned over to Chloe. He's not just fighting a system anymore, he's building a new one. But the battle wasn't over. That night, Malcolm was approached by a familiar face, Senator Harmon, who had been silent through the entire ordeal. You made a lot of enemies, Malcolm, Harmon said, tone edged with warning. People who don't like being exposed. Malcolm didn't flinch. Good. That means they noticed. Harmon smirked. You're not afraid this will cost you your contracts? Your influence? I already paid a higher price, Malcolm replied. I lost a brother. Then came the twist. Later that week, during a live Senate ethics hearing, a whistleblower from inside the Department of Defense testified that Secretary Burke had not only orchestrated the smear campaign against Joe, but had also authorized black bag operations to intimidate potential leakers, one of whom had been found dead 2 years earlier in what was ruled a suicide. It wasn't. The courtroom fell silent as the revelation hit. Burke, now under criminal indictment, sat stone-faced while the entire chamber stared. Malcolm watched from a viewing room. No satisfaction, no smugness, just resolve. After the hearing, he returned to Arlington. This time it wasn't a funeral. It was a dedication. A new monument stood at the edge of Section 60, smaller than most, but powerful in presence. A bronze figure of a soldier holding his helmet against his chest. The inscription read, Truth never dies in silence. In honor of General Joseph Whitaker. Standing among a modest crowd, Malcolm laid a single white rose at the base and stepped back. Chloe reached for his hand. He'd be proud, she whispered. He'd say it's just the beginning, Malcolm answered. And it was. The screen fades to black. Then words appear, inspired by true events. Speak up. Stand firm. Be the change. If this story moved you, share it. Support our channel for more stories that expose truth and honor courage. Because some stories don't end at the funeral. They begin there,